The winter wind howled outside like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters of Rose Campbell's small cabin on the outskirts of San Angelo, Texas. It was 1878, and Rose had never felt more alone than she did tonight, cradling her feverish 6-year-old son against her chest, his small body burning with a heat that scared her to her very core. "Mama, it hurts," Samuel whimpered, his usually bright eyes glazed with fever. "I know, my sweet boy," Rose whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead, wincing at the heat radiating from his skin. "You'll feel better soon." She prayed her words weren't a lie. 3 days ago, her husband Thomas had ridden out to fetch supplies, and the town doctor, after Samuel's sniffles, had transformed into something far more sinister. 3 days, and neither Thomas nor help had arrived. The blizzard that had swept across the Texas plains had likely made travel impossible, but that knowledge did little to ease her growing panic. Samuel's breathing grew more labored as the night deepened. Rose had tried every home remedy she knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea, the last of her precious honey mixed with whiskey, but nothing seemed to break his fever. His little chest rattled with each breath, and the sound pierced her heart. The knock at the door came just as midnight approached, startling Rose so badly she nearly dropped the basin of water she was carrying to Samuel's bedside. No one should be out in weather like this, especially not at this hour. Fear and hope warred within her as she grabbed her late father's shotgun from beside the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Madam, I saw your light. Name's Colton Archer. I was passing through when the storm hit. My horse is about done in, and I could use shelter if you can spare it." Rose hesitated, her knuckles white around the shotgun. A stranger in the night was as likely to be danger as salvation. But Samuel's painful cough from the bedroom made her decision. "I'm armed," she warned, pulling open the door just enough to see the man standing on her porch. He stood tall despite being hunched against the cold, snow crusting his shoulders and the brim of his hat. His face was partially hidden by a thick scarf, but she could see kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I mean no harm, madam," he said, slowly raising gloved hands to show they were empty. "Just looking for shelter from this storm." Another racking cough from Samuel made Rose's decision. "My son is sick," she said abruptly. "Very sick. If you're coming in, I haven't got time to entertain." The stranger Colton nodded solemnly. "I've some experience with fevers and such. Used to help the doctor back home. Might be I could lend a hand." Rose studied him a moment longer. His eyes held no malice she could detect, only genuine concern. With the storm raging and Samuel growing worse by the hour, she was running out of options. "Come in then," she said, stepping aside. Colton stomped the snow from his boots before entering, immediately removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with early threads of silver at the temples. He unwound his scarf, and Rose saw a face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way that spoke of hard living. He wasn't young, perhaps 35 or so, but he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his skin. "Your boy's in there?" he asked, nodding toward the small bedroom where Samuel's labored breathing could be heard. Rose nodded, suddenly overcome with emotion. "He's been sick 3 days. My husband rode for the doctor, but with this storm." Her voice trailed off. Colton set his saddlebags down and removed his heavy coat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the bedroom. Rose led him to Samuel's bedside, where the boy lay tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his cheeks flushed crimson against too pale skin. Colton's expression grew serious as he knelt beside the bed, placing a large, gentle hand on Samuel's forehead. "He's burning up something fierce," he murmured, then looked up at Rose. "How long's he been this hot?" "Since yesterday morning. It just keeps getting worse. Colton nodded, opening Samuel's nightshirt to listen to his chest. His ear pressed against the boy's thin chest, his expression grave as he straightened. His lungs are congested, pneumonia most likely. Rose's knees threatened to buckle. Pneumonia had taken her sister 2 winters past. "Can you help him?" she whispered. Colton looked at her, his blue eyes steady and calm in a way that somehow steadied her too. "I will help," he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. "We'll need to break that fever first. Do you have any onions, mustard powder, honey?" "Onions in the root cellar, a little honey left." "Good." "And clean cloths. As many as you can spare." As Rose gathered the supplies, she watched Colton speak softly to Samuel, his large hand gently brushing the boy's damp hair from his forehead. There was something so tender in the gesture that it made her throat tight with emotion. Through the long night hours, Colton worked tirelessly. He fashioned onion poultices for Samuel's chest and feet, prepared a honey and herb tea that he coaxed down the boy's throat spoonful by spoonful, and constantly changed the cool cloths on his forehead. He showed Rose how to properly thump Samuel's back to loosen the congestion in his lungs, his hands guiding hers with patience and care. "My ma used to say sickness gets worse at night because darkness gives it strength," Colton said softly as they worked side by side in the lamplight. "But it also means if we can get him through till dawn, we've won half the battle." Rose studied his profile as he bent over Samuel. "How do you know so much about treating illness?" A shadow crossed his face. "My wife and son fell sick 5 years back. Influenza. I learned everything I could to save them." The unspoken end to his story hung in the air between them. Rose placed her hand lightly on his forearm. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "The fever's the enemy now. We need to keep fighting it." As the night deepened, Samuel's breathing grew more labored. Rose felt panic rising in her chest as his small body shook with chills despite the heat radiating from his skin. "He's getting worse," she whispered, fear threatening to overwhelm her. Colton's face was grim, but his voice remained steady. "We need to cool him down more drastically. When I was in the cavalry, we'd use snow packs for men with dangerous fevers." "Snow?" Rose questioned. "Wrapped in cloths placed at the pulse point's neck, wrists, behind the knees." "It's risky, but his fever's dangerously high." Rose hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Show me." Together they worked quickly, Colton bringing in fresh snow while Rose prepared the cloths. Their movements fell into an easy rhythm as though they'd worked together for years instead of hours. When Samuel whimpered in discomfort at the cold packs, Colton spoke to him in a low, soothing voice that seemed to calm him. "That's it, little man. You're doing just fine, brave as any soldier I ever knew." It was nearly 3 in the morning when Samuel's fever finally broke. Rose had dozed off briefly in the chair beside his bed, exhaustion finally claiming her when Colton's gentle touch on her shoulder woke her. "Rose," he said softly, using her name for the first time. "Feel his forehead." She pressed her palm to Samuel's brow, tears springing to her eyes when she felt the cooler skin. "The fever's down," she breathed. "Significantly," Colton agreed, a tired smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "His breathing's easier too. I think we've turned the corner." Relief flooded through Rose so powerfully that she swayed on her feet. Colton steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch warm and reassuring. "You should rest," he said. "I'll keep watch over him." Rose shook her head. "I couldn't possibly sleep now." "Then at least sit." "I'll make us some coffee." In the small kitchen, Rose watched as Colton moved with quiet efficiency, locating the coffee pot and beans without needing to ask. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and dependable in a way that made her feel safe for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said as he handed her a steaming mug. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." He settled into the chair across from her. "You'd have managed. You strike me as a woman who finds a way through." "Perhaps," she admitted, "but I'm grateful nonetheless." She studied him over the rim of her mug. "Where were you headed before the storm caught you?" "No place in particular," he replied, a certain guardedness entering his expression. "I tend to follow work where I can find it. Ranch hand, scout, whatever pays." "A drifter, then?" He nodded. "Been that way since I lost my family. Couldn't stomach staying in one place with all those memories." The sadness in his voice resonated with something in Rose. "I understand that feeling," she said softly. "After my parents died, I wanted nothing more than to leave our homestead." Too many empty chairs at the table. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two people who understood loss without needing to explain it further. "How long have you been in San Angelo?" Colton asked. "Just over a year." "Thomas, my husband, he had a friend who knew of work at the sawmill here. We came from Missouri looking for a fresh start." "And have you found it?" Rose considered the question. "Some days I think so, others." She trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of her marriage to a stranger, no matter how kind he'd been. Colton seemed to understand her hesitation. "Life out here isn't easy on anyone," he said diplomatically. "Especially not on women." "No, it isn't," Rose agreed. "But we endure." They talked through the remaining hours of darkness, checking on Samuel regularly. Colton told her of his travels across the Western Territories, painting vivid pictures of mountains that touched the sky and deserts that glowed red at sunset. Rose shared stories of growing up in Missouri, of learning healing from her grandmother, of her dreams of someday having a proper garden instead of just the necessary vegetables. As dawn broke across the eastern sky, Samuel's condition had improved enough that Rose allowed herself to truly breathe again. His fever remained down, and while his cough was still present, it no longer held the frightening rattle of fluid in his lungs. "You should get some rest," Colton told her as she yawned for the third time in as many minutes. "I'll keep an eye on Samuel." "You've been up all night too," she protested. "I'm used to it. Trail life doesn't allow for regular sleeping habits." His smile was gentle. "Just a couple hours." "You'll be no good to your boy if you collapse from exhaustion." Rose knew he was right. "Wake me if anything changes," she insisted, and he promised he would. She meant to lie down on the small settee in the front room, but found herself drawn to her own bed instead. The sheets were cool against her skin, and despite her worries, exhaustion pulled her quickly into sleep. When Rose woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. She sat up with a start, realizing she'd slept far longer than she'd intended. Panic seized her momentarily until she heard the sound of Samuel's laughter drifting from the front room. She found them at the kitchen table, Samuel propped up on cushions, a bowl of broth before him. Colton sat beside him, whittling a small piece of wood into what appeared to be the shape of a horse. "Mama," Samuel called when he saw her, his voice weak but distinctly cheerful. "Mr. Archer is making me a whole herd of horses." Relief washed over Rose at the sight of color in her son's cheeks and the brightness in his eyes. She crossed to him, pressing a kiss to his forehead. His skin was cool to the touch, with only the slightest lingering warmth of a mild fever. "I see that," she said, smiling at the small wooden figure taking shape in Colton's hands. "And you're feeling better," Samuel nodded. "My chest still hurts when I cough, but Mr. Archer says that's normal." "It is," Colton confirmed, looking up at Rose. "The congestion is clearing." "He's on the mend." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Colton shook his head slightly. "No need for thanks, I'm just glad I could help." The day passed in a gentle rhythm. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving a crystalline blue sky and a landscape transformed by deep snow. Colton ventured out to tend to his horse, which he'd sheltered in Rose's small barn, and to gather more firewood. Rose focused on keeping Samuel comfortable, encouraged by his improving appetite and decreasing cough. By evening, a new worry had begun to gnaw at her. Thomas should have returned by now, storm or no storm. The roads would be passable again, and San Angelo was only half a day's ride away. She tried to hide her concern, but Colton noticed her frequent glances toward the window. "Your husband should have made it back by now," he observed quietly as they prepared the evening meal together. Rose nodded, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. Yes, he should have. Perhaps he got caught on the far side of the storm. Roads might still be bad in some places. Perhaps. She didn't look up from her work. Colton was silent for a moment. Or perhaps there's another reason you're not surprised by his absence. Rose's hand stilled in the dough. She hadn't spoken of it to anyone: the gambling, the drinking, Thomas's increasing absences. The way he'd look at her sometimes with resentment instead of love, as though she and Samuel were burdens rather than family. "Thomas finds comfort in whiskey and cards," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "More so lately. Sometimes he loses track of time." Colton didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice held no judgment. "Must be hard, carrying everything on your own shoulders." The simple acknowledgement of her situation, spoken aloud for the first time, caused something to crack open inside Rose. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping it away with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of flour on her face. "I shouldn't burden you with my troubles." Colton reached out, his thumb gently brushing away the flour. The touch was brief but tender. "Sharing a burden makes it lighter to bear. That's not something that needs apologizing for." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Rose felt a strange flutter in her chest that both alarmed and intrigued her. She stepped back slightly, returning her attention to the bread dough. "Samuel adores you already," she said, changing the subject. "He's never taken to strangers so quickly." Colton smiled, accepting her redirection. "He's a fine boy, smart as a whip, too. Been telling me all about the constellations his grandpa taught him." "My father," Rose explained. "He loved the stars. Used to say they were the same no matter where you wandered, so you could never truly be lost." "Wise man." "He was." Rose shaped the dough into a loaf and set it aside to rise. "What about your family? You mentioned your wife and son, but what about your parents? Gone long before I lost Hannah and little James. Pa died in a mining accident when I was 14. Ma followed a year later, just gave up, I think. My older brother raised me after that, but he was killed at Shiloh." "You've lost a great deal," Rose said softly. Colton's eyes held a faraway look. "We all carry our share of ghosts out here." As evening settled over the cabin, Samuel asked for a story before bed. Colton obliged with a tale of a brave young cowboy who befriended a wild Mustang, his deep voice painting such vivid pictures that even Rose found herself captivated. Samuel drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, his breath still slightly wheezy but vastly improved from the previous night. In the quiet that followed, Rose and Colton sat before the hearth, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, hinting at another possible storm. "You'll stay tonight?" Rose asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "The weather's turning again." Colton nodded. "If you're sure it's no imposition." "You saved my son's life," Rose said simply. "You'll always be welcome here." A comfortable silence fell between them. Rose found herself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hardship. "What will you do?" he asked eventually. "If your husband doesn't return." The question was direct, but not unkind. Rose appreciated that he didn't pretend the possibility didn't exist. "Keep going," she answered. "I have some savings hidden away. Not much, but enough to get by for a while. I can take in laundry, maybe sewing. People always need mending done. You've thought about this before." "Yes," she admitted. "More than I should, perhaps." Colton turned to face her fully. "There's no shame in preparing for hard possibilities, Rose. That's just survival." "And what about you?" she asked. "Will you keep drifting forever?" He considered the question seriously. "I always thought I would. After Hannah and James died, staying still hurt too much. But lately—" He paused, staring into the fire. "Lately, I've been thinking it might be time to find a place to put down roots again." "What changed your mind?" "Just a feeling that maybe there's more to life than running from memories." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the evening wore on. Colton told her about his time as a cavalry scout, about the characters he'd met in mining towns and cattle drives. Rose shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, of the apple orchard behind her parents' house, of her dreams of someday having a place that truly felt like home again. It was nearly midnight when they finally retired, Colton insisting on taking the settee while Rose returned to her bedroom. As she drifted toward sleep, Rose realized she felt more at peace than she had in months, despite the uncertainty of her situation. There was something about Colton's steady presence that made her feel the world was not quite as harsh a place as she'd come to believe. Morning brought clear skies and the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Rose was at the stove preparing breakfast when she heard them, and her heart lurched in her chest. Colton, who had been checking on Samuel, appeared in the doorway, his expression questioning. "Expecting company?" he asked quietly. Before Rose could answer, the door burst open and Thomas Campbell stumbled in. He was unshaven, his clothes rumpled, and the sour smell of whiskey clung to him despite the early hour. His bloodshot eyes took in the scene before him. Rose at the stove, Colton standing nearby, and his face darkened with anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his words slightly slurred. "Gone 3 days and you've already got another man in my house." Rose felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. Thomas had never struck her, but she'd seen the rage building in him over the past months, had watched as whiskey loosened his control over his temper. "Thomas, this is Mr. Archer," she said, keeping her voice calm. "He was caught in the storm and needed shelter." "Samuel was very ill." "Samuel," Thomas interrupted, seeming to remember his son for the first time. "What's wrong with the boy?" "Pneumonia," Colton answered, his tone neutral but his posture alert. "He's on the mend now, but it was a close thing." Thomas's gaze swung back to Colton, assessing him with narrowed eyes. "And who exactly are you to be diagnosing my son?" "Just a traveler with some medical knowledge. Your wife was alone, your son desperately ill. I offered what help I could." Thomas swayed slightly on his feet. "That right? And I suppose you're just being neighborly, staying the night too?" "The storm made travel impossible," Rose interjected. "Mr. Archer was kind enough to sit up with Samuel while I rested. Without his help, our son might have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Our son, is it?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "And where's the doctor I rode out to fetch? Did you even try to find him?" The accusation stung Rose deeply. "You never returned with the doctor, Thomas. We were alone. Because that damned Sawbones was out delivering a baby. I waited a whole day for him to return, then the storm hit. I got caught in Haney's Crossing." His gaze shifted between them suspiciously. "Convenient timing for you, wasn't it?" Colton took a step forward. "Mr. Campbell, you're upset and I understand why. Finding a stranger in your home is unsettling. But I assure you, My presence here has been nothing but proper. Your wife has conducted herself with nothing but dignity during a difficult situation. I don't need a lecture on my wife's conduct from some drifter, Thomas spat. What I need is for you to get off my property. Samuel's voice came from the bedroom doorway. Papa, why are you yelling at Mr. Archer? He made me better. All three adults turned to see Samuel standing there in his nightshirt, still pale but obviously improved from his ordeal. Thomas's expression softened slightly at the sight of his son. Samuel, you should be in bed, Rose said gently. I heard Papa shouting, the boy replied, his eyes wide with confusion. Mr. Archer made me special tea and told me stories when I couldn't sleep. He helped me get better. Thomas looked from his son to Colton, some of the anger draining from his face. Is that so? Samuel nodded earnestly. He stayed up all night with me when I was real sick. He said he would help, and he did, Papa. He made the bad cough go away. A complex mix of emotions crossed Thomas's face: relief at seeing his son recovering, lingering suspicion, and something like shame. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Well, he said awkwardly, I suppose I should thank you then. Colton nodded once. No thanks needed. I'm just glad the boy's recovering. He moved to gather his few belongings. I'll be on my way now that you're home. Rose felt an unexpected pang at his words. In the short time Colton had been with them, he had become a reassuring presence, a solid point in her uncertain world. The thought of him riding away left her feeling strangely bereft. At least stay for breakfast, she found herself saying. I've already prepared enough for everyone. Thomas frowned, but Samuel's pleading look seemed to sway him. Fine, he conceded grudgingly. One meal, and then you're on your way. The breakfast that followed was a tense affair. Thomas ate silently, his eyes frequently darting between Rose and Colton with lingering suspicion. Samuel, oblivious to the undercurrents, chattered happily to Colton about the wooden horses he'd been carving for him. When the meal was finished, Colton rose to take his leave. I'll get my horse ready, he said, nodding to Thomas. Thank you for the hospitality, Mr. Campbell. I'll help you gather your things, Rose offered, needing a moment away from Thomas's watchful gaze. Outside at the small barn, as Colton saddled his gelding, Rose finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. I wish you didn't have to go, she admitted quietly. Colton paused in tightening the cinch. It's for the best, Rose. Your husband's home now. Yes, she looked down at her hands. I want to thank you properly for Samuel, for everything you already have. He turned to face her, his expression gentle. You're a remarkable woman, Rose Campbell, strong in ways I don't think you even realize. Not strong enough, perhaps, she said, thinking of the life she had accepted, the compromises she had made. We all do what we must to survive, Colton replied. There's no shame in that. Will you? She hesitated, unsure if she had the right to ask. Will you be passing through San Angelo again? Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or possibility. Hard to say where the trail might lead me, Rose nodded, understanding the careful non-answer for what it was. Of course. Colton finished saddling his horse and gathered his few belongings. As he prepared to mount, he turned to her one last time. Rose, he said, his voice low, if you ever have need. He didn't finish the thought but reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. My brother had a small place just outside of Fredericksburg. I check for mail there every few months. If you ever write, I'll get it eventually. Rose took the paper, their fingers brushing momentarily. Thank you, she whispered. He mounted up with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Take care of that boy of yours, he said. He's got his mother's spirit. That'll serve him well. With a tip of his hat, Colton rode away from the cabin, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast Texas landscape. Rose stood watching until he disappeared from sight, the paper clutched tightly in her hand, an unexpected sense of loss settling in her chest. Inside, Thomas was sitting with Samuel, actually listening as the boy excitedly recounted his illness and recovery. It was the most attention Rose had seen him pay to their son in months. Perhaps the fear of losing Samuel had awakened something in him that had been dormant too long. For 3 days, Thomas remained unusually attentive and sober. He chopped firewood, repaired a leak in the roof that Rose had been unable to reach, and even brought home a small carved wooden toy from town for Samuel. Rose allowed herself to hope that perhaps the scare with Samuel's illness had jolted him back to the man she had once married, the hard-working, kind man who had promised to build her a life of security and happiness. On the 4th night, however, Thomas didn't come home from work. Rose sat up until midnight, then tucked the disappointed Samuel into bed with assurances that Papa must have been asked to work late at the sawmill. By morning, when Thomas still hadn't returned, the familiar knot of anxiety had reformed in her stomach. He stumbled in just after noon, reeking of whiskey and cheap perfume, his pockets empty of the week's wages. The cycle had begun again, and this time, Rose felt something inside her harden with resolve. This was not the life she wanted for Samuel, nor for herself. For the next 2 weeks, Rose quietly made preparations. She sold a gold locket that had belonged to her grandmother, using part of the money to purchase supplies, setting the rest aside with her small savings. She mended and packed their warmest clothes, and spent hours studying the map of Texas she'd found in a drawer. Thomas's drinking worsened. He lost his job at the sawmill after showing up drunk 3 days in a row, and his resentment toward Rose and Samuel grew more pronounced with each passing day. The night he overturned the dinner table in a rage because the stew was too salty was the night Rose made her final decision. "We're leaving tomorrow," she told Samuel as she tucked him in that night, after Thomas had stormed out once again. "We're going to take a little trip, just you and me." Samuel's eyes widened. "What about Papa?" Rose stroked his hair gently. "Papa needs time to get better, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups get sick in ways that aren't like your pneumonia. They get sick in their hearts and minds, and they need time alone to heal." "Is it because Papa drinks the special water that makes him angry?" Rose swallowed hard. "Yes, partly, but it's not your fault, Samuel. Not one bit of it is because of you." "Where will we go?" he asked, his small face solemn. Rose thought of the piece of paper Colton had given her, carefully hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. "I thought we might visit Fredericksburg. It's supposed to be a nice town with lots of friendly people." Samuel considered this. "Will Mr. Archer be there?" "He said he'd finish my horse herd someday." "I don't know, sweetheart," Rose answered honestly, "but maybe we'll find out." The next morning, Rose rose before dawn and loaded their few belongings into the small wagon she'd purchased from Widow Jensen down the road. She left a note for Thomas, explaining that she couldn't subject Samuel to his drinking and rages any longer, that she would contact him when they were settled somewhere safe. She left her wedding ring beside the note, a final statement that needed no words. The journey to Fredericksburg was arduous, taking nearly 2 weeks as they followed the winding roads through the Texas Hill Country. Samuel proved to be a resilient traveler, fascinated by the changing landscape and wildlife they encountered. Rose found strength she hadn't known she possessed, handling the wagon over rough terrain, making camp each night, keeping them both fed and warm despite the lingering winter chill. Fredericksburg itself was a pleasant surprise, a tidy town with a strong German influence, evident in the architecture and the mouth-watering smells wafting from the bakery on the main street. Rose found lodging at a small boarding house run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Schmidt, who took one look at Rose's tired face and Samuel's eager one, and immediately offered them hot soup and fresh bread. "You looking for work, dearie?" Mrs. Schmidt asked as Rose settled their belongings into the small but clean room they'd rented. "Yes, anything respectable," Rose answered. "I can cook, clean, so I know some nursing as well." Mrs. Schmidt's eyes brightened. "Nursing, you say? Dr. Berger's been looking for someone to help at his clinic. His nurse got married last month and moved to Austin with her new husband." "I'm not formally trained," Rose warned. "Just knowledge passed down from my grandmother and my own experience." "Practical experience counts for more than fancy schooling out here," Mrs. Schmidt declared. "You go see him tomorrow. I'll watch your boy while you do." The next morning, after settling Samuel with Mrs. Schmidt and a pile of wooden blocks to play with, Rose made her way to Dr. Berger's clinic. The doctor, a round, balding man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, interviewed her briefly before declaring her exactly what he needed. "You've a calm manner about you," he said. "That's half the battle in healing. People need to trust their caregiver. The rest can be taught." Rose started work that very afternoon, beginning what would become a transformative period in her life. Dr. Berger proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to prepare medicines, clean and dress wounds, and assist during examinations. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, and Rose found herself absorbing knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. Samuel thrived in Fredericksburg as well. Mrs. Schmidt introduced him to her grandson, Fritz, a boy just a year older than Samuel, and the two quickly became inseparable. Rose's heart lightened each day seeing her son laugh and play without the shadow of fear that had hung over him in their old home. 2 months after their arrival, Rose finally gathered the courage to visit the local post office. She had written a letter to Colton weeks before but had held on to it, uncertain if sending it was wise. Now, she handed it to the postmaster with only slight hesitation. "This address," the postmaster said, squinting at the paper. "That's the old Archer place out by Petternails River." Rose's heart quickened. "You know it?" "Sure do. Hasn't been lived in regular since old James Archer died in the war, but his brother stops by now and then. Keeps it maintained." "His brother?" Rose tried to keep her voice casual. "Would that be Colton Archer?" The postmaster nodded. "That's him. Good man, Colt. Helped my brother-in-law round up strays after that big storm last spring, wouldn't take a penny for it." He tucked Rose's letter into a sorting box. "He was actually through here about a week ago. Said he'd be back in a month or so to check on things." Rose felt a flutter of anticipation at this news. "Thank you," she said, and left before her face could betray the emotions churning within her. The days that followed took on a new dimension of expectation. Rose threw herself into her work at the clinic, expanding her skills under Dr. Berger's tutelage, but part of her mind was always wondering would Colton return as the postmaster had suggested. Would he respond to her letter? The answer came on a warm spring afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after she'd sent her letter. Rose was just finishing up at the clinic when Mrs. Schmidt's grandson Fritz came running in, out of breath with excitement. "Mrs. Campbell," he called, "there's a cowboy asking for you at Grandma's house. He's got presents for Samuel." Rose's heart leapt in her chest. She quickly tidied the examination room and bid goodbye to Dr. Berger before following Fritz back to the boarding house, trying to keep her pace measured despite the urge to run. She found him sitting on Mrs. Schmidt's front porch, Samuel on his knee, exclaiming over a beautifully carved wooden horse. Colton looked up as she approached, and the smile that spread across his face sent warmth flooding through her. "Rose," he said, standing and setting Samuel gently on his feet, "you're looking well." "As are you," she replied, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't anticipated, Mrs. Schmidt appeared in the doorway, her shrewd eyes taking in the scene. "Mr. Archer, you'll stay for supper, won't you? I've made sauerbraten and dumplings." "I wouldn't dream of refusing, madam," Colton replied politely, though his eyes never left Rose's face over Mrs. Schmidt's hearty German meal, with Samuel chattering excitedly between them. Rose felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Colton told them of his recent travels, of the cattle drive he'd helped with up to Kansas, of the beautiful spring wildflowers covering the hills around his brother's old property. "I got your letter," he said quietly when Samuel had run off to show Fritz his new horse. "It was waiting when I checked the place last week." Rose nodded, suddenly uncertain of what to say. Her letter had been carefully worded, telling him of their move to Fredericksburg, of her position with Dr. Berger, of Samuel asking about him. She had not mentioned her feelings, the ones that had grown stronger in his absence rather than fading as she had expected. "I'm glad you and Samuel got away," Colton continued. "It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Rose admitted, "but it was necessary. And your husband, has he?" Rose shook her head. "No word. I left a clear message, though. I think he understood it was final." Colton's eyes held a question he seemed hesitant to ask. Rose answered it anyway. "I don't regret leaving, Colton, not for a moment." His smile returned, warming his features. "Good. You deserve better than fear and uncertainty, Rose. Both of you do." Later, after Samuel had been tucked into bed, Colton and Rose sat on the boarding house porch, watching fireflies rise from the nearby meadow. The evening air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about settling down," Colton said after a comfortable silence. "My brother's place needs work, but the bones are good. There's fine grazing land, a solid barn, a creek with clean water." Rose's heart quickened. "What made you decide to stop drifting?" He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "I think you know," he said softly. Rose did know, but she needed to hear it spoken aloud. "Tell me anyway," she whispered. "From the moment I saw you standing in that doorway, shotgun in hand, protecting your son." He smiled at the memory. "Something in me recognized something in you, a kind of knowing that I haven't felt since Hannah." "I felt it too," Rose admitted. "It scared me. And now it gives me hope." She reached out, her fingers lightly touching his. "But I need time, Colton. I need to be sure of myself before I can be sure of anyone else." He turned his hand to clasp hers gently. "I understand that, and I respect it. I'm not going anywhere, Rose." Not anymore. The weeks that followed established a new pattern to Rose's life. Colton divided his time between Fredericksburg and his brother's property, which he was steadily restoring. He brought Samuel along sometimes, teaching the boy about horses, how to fish in the Pedernales River, how to identify animal tracks in the soft earth by the creek. Rose continued her work with Dr. Berger, her skills growing until the doctor trusted her with many procedures on her own. The townsfolk came to respect her calm efficiency and genuine concern for their well-being, and she found herself accepted into the community in a way she'd never experienced in San Angelo. Summer arrived with blazing heat and afternoon thunderstorms that transformed the hill country into a lush green paradise. On a particularly beautiful Sunday in late June, Colton invited Rose and Samuel for a picnic at his place. "I want to show you the improvements," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "The house is finally weathertight again." The Archer homestead was indeed transformed from the neglected property Colton had described in his stories. The small stone house gleamed with fresh whitewash, its windows sparkling in the sunlight. A garden had been started along the southern wall, and the barn had been repaired, housing Colton's horses and a milk cow he'd recently purchased. "It's lovely," Rose said, genuinely impressed by the work he'd accomplished. "It's still simple," Colton replied, "but it's becoming a home again." They spread their picnic under a massive oak tree near the creek, Samuel immediately rushing off to explore the shallow water with a homemade fishing pole Colton had prepared for him. Rose watched her son's carefree play with a full heart. "He's changed so much since we left San Angelo," she observed. "He laughs more easily now." "Children are resilient," Colton said. "Given safety and love, they can overcome almost anything." "And adults?" Rose asked. "Are we as resilient?" Colton considered her question seriously. "In different ways, perhaps. Our scars run deeper, but we also have the wisdom to understand what's truly important." He looked at her intently. "What's truly important to you, Rose?" She watched Samuel splashing happily in the creek before answering. "Safety for my son. Work that matters. The freedom to make my own choices." She paused, gathering her courage. "And you, Colton, you've become important to me in ways I never expected." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the horizon. "I've loved you since that first night," he said simply. "Watching you fight for your son's life with such fierce determination, seeing your strength and your tenderness together, I knew then that if I ever found a home again, I wanted it to be with you." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. "I'm still married, Colton. In the eyes of the law, at least." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'll wait as long as necessary, but I wanted you to know where my heart stands." They sat in companionable silence, watching Samuel's play. After a while, the boy came running back, proudly displaying a small fish he'd caught. Colton showed him how to clean it properly, and they added it to their picnic, cooking it over a small fire. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Rose felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was what she had always wanted, this sense of peace, of belonging, of being valued for exactly who she was. "We should head back to town soon," she said reluctantly as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Colton nodded, but made no move to pack up their things. "Rose," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I have something to tell you." A flutter of anxiety disturbed her peaceful mood. "What is it?" "I received word from San Angelo last week. Thomas was in a brawl at the Painted Lady Saloon. He pulled a knife on another gambler." Colton paused, his eyes gentle on her face. "He didn't survive, Rose. I'm sorry to bring you such news, but I thought you should know." Rose sat very still, absorbing this information. She had expected to feel something, grief, perhaps, or anger, or even relief. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as though the news concerned a stranger rather than the man she had once loved. "Poor Thomas," she said finally. "He never found his way back from whatever darkness took him." Colton covered her hand with his. "Are you all right?" Rose considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I mourned the loss of my marriage long before now. I'm sad for what might have been, but that man hasn't been my husband in truth for a very long time." Samuel came running up, oblivious to the serious conversation. "Can we come back tomorrow, Mr. Archer? I want to catch a bigger fish." Colton ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "We'll come back very soon, I promise, but now we should get your mama home before dark." As they packed up their picnic and headed back to town, Rose found herself contemplating the strange turns life could take. She had never imagined leaving her marriage, never dreamed she would find herself a widow at 30. Yet here she was, independent for perhaps the first time in her life, with possibilities stretching before her that she'd never dared contemplate before. The news of Thomas's death spread quickly through Fredericksburg's small community. Most offered Rose their condolences, though few had known Thomas personally. Dr. Berger insisted she take a few days off from the clinic, despite her protests that she was fine and preferred to keep busy. "Take the time to settle your affairs," he advised kindly. "The sick will still be here when you return." Rose used the time to write to the authorities in San Angelo, confirming Thomas's death and inquiring about any outstanding matters that needed her attention. There were few. Thomas had left nothing but debts behind, and the cabin they had lived in belonged to the sawmill. A week after receiving the news, Rose visited the local church and lit a candle for Thomas's soul. She said a simple prayer, asking for peace for the troubled man she had once loved, and then let him go from her heart. That evening, she invited Colton to dinner at the boarding house. Mrs. Schmidt, with her uncanny sense for important occasions, prepared an especially nice meal, and then conveniently remembered an errand that required her to leave Rose, Colton, and Samuel alone in the parlor after they had eaten. Samuel fell asleep on the settee, the excitement of the day and a full stomach conspiring to overcome his usual resistance to bedtime. Rose covered him with a light blanket, then joined Colton by the window, where he stood watching the street lamps being lit as dusk descended. "I've been thinking," she said softly, so as not to wake Samuel. Colton turned to her, his eyes reflecting the warm lamplight. "About what?" "About the future. About what I want for Samuel and myself." She took a deep breath. "About your brother's homestead and how peaceful it feels there." A careful hope dawned in Colton's expression. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That perhaps it's time to make a proper home for Samuel, a place with land for him to explore, animals to care for, room to grow." She met his gaze steadily. "A place with a good man who loves him almost as much as I do." Colton stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Rose Campbell, are you proposing to me?" There was a hint of teasing in his voice, but his eyes were serious. Rose felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I suppose I am, in a manner of speaking. That is, if you're still interested in having us disrupt your peaceful bachelor existence." "Disrupt?" Colton laughed softly. "You and Samuel are the peace I've been searching for these past 5 years." He squeezed her hands gently. "I should be the one asking properly. Rose, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making a home with me, raising Samuel together, perhaps adding to our family someday?" Rose felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Colton's kiss was gentle, a promise of deeper passion held in check by the presence of the sleeping child nearby. When they parted, Rose felt as though her heart might burst with the joy flooding through her. "When?" Colton asked, his arms still around her waist. "After a proper mourning period," Rose answered. "Not for my sake, but for the town's sensibilities. Perhaps by autumn." "Autumn sounds perfect," Colton agreed. "The hills will be golden, the harvest in. A good time for new beginnings." They were married on a crisp October day, when the hills around Fredericksburg blazed with autumn colors. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the Archer homestead's front yard beneath an arbor Colton had built for the occasion and decorated with late-blooming wildflowers. Dr. Berger gave Rose away, beaming with fatherly pride. Samuel, dressed in his best suit and solemnly aware of his importance as ring-bearer, performed his duty perfectly before breaking into an excited dance when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Mrs. Schmidt had organized the wedding feast, enlisting half the town's German housewives to prepare a spectacular spread. As Rose and Colton accepted congratulations from their friends and neighbors, she felt a sense of community that had been missing from her life for too long. "Happy," Colton whispered in her ear as they shared the first dance. Rose looked around at their home, for it truly felt like home now, at Samuel playing with the other children, at the faces of people who had accepted her, and her son with open hearts. Then she looked back at her new husband, at the love shining in his eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that the night he had knocked on her door during that terrible blizzard had been the beginning of the life she was meant to live. "Completely," she answered, and sealed her words with a kiss. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. Colton expanded their holdings, gradually building a respectable ranch with a small herd of cattle and a reputation for well-bred horses. Rose continued working with Dr. Berger 2 days a week, using her skills to serve the community while maintaining her home and family. Samuel grew into a strong, thoughtful young man with his mother's compassionate nature and Colton's affinity for horses. He called Colton Pa now, a transition that had happened naturally about a year after the wedding, and the bond between them was as strong as any blood tie could have been. 2 years after their marriage, Rose gave birth to twins, a boy they named James Thomas, honoring both Colton's lost son and Rose's first husband, and a girl they called Hannah Grace, after Colton's first wife and Rose's grandmother. As Rose watched her growing family thrive in the home they had built together, she often thought back to that desperate night when a sick child and a howling blizzard had brought Colton Archer to her door. What had seemed like the darkest moment of her life had actually been the first light of dawn breaking over a new day. On the twins' 5th birthday, as the family gathered around the table for cake, Samuel, now 16 and nearly as tall as Colton, raised his glass of lemonade for a toast. "To Pa," he said, who kept his promise to help and never stopped. Colton's eyes misted as he looked around the table at his family. "Best promise I ever made," he said, reaching for Rose's hand, "and the easiest to keep." Rose squeezed his fingers, her heart full. "To promises kept," she said softly. "And to the night a cowboy sat up with a sick child and changed all our lives forever." The twins, not fully understanding the significance but caught up in the moment, clinked their cups enthusiastically. "To promises," they chorused, making everyone laugh. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Rose and Colton stood on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. Colton wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his solid warmth. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he still posed occasionally, as though part of him couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Rose turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved features that had only grown more dear with time. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Every step, every choice, even the painful ones, led me here to you, to our family. How could I regret any of it?" Colton kissed her then, with the same tenderness and passion that still took her breath away after all these years. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I told you I would help," he reminded her, smiling. "I just didn't realize I was helping myself find home again." "Home isn't a place," Rose said softly, echoing words her father had once spoken. "It's where love dwells." As they stood together under the Texas stars, surrounded by the life they had built from the ashes of loss and heartbreak, Rose knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had once sat up all night with a sick child and changed the course of all their lives with a simple promise to help.